Let's go ahead and get started. There's a lot of places or a lot of topics I want to hit on today, but the place I want to start on is you grew up in Santa Ana, and I also read too that you grew up without a father figure or father in your family. But who are some of those father figures from outside that kind of played a role in your life?
Good question. Good question. I'm gonna go. When I think about father figures, man, my grandfather, my Enrique Prieto. He was like my dad. He was like the first guy, because I remember being a little boy, and I remember growing up in a household with my mom and my grandma and my grandpa, and nobody like ever mentioned like what a dad was or what a dad did, because I didn't have it, and like I didn't have a dad on my birth certificate, and so I remember as I got older, I started identifying my grandpa as my dad, because he did all those things that a dad should do, and then as I grew older, I learned that being a dad isn't something that you just it's not something you become. It's something that you do, right? So my grandfather did everything that a dad is supposed to do, and to the day that I'm no longer here, I'll look at him as my dad.
Yeah, that's awesome to hear. I know I had a lot of friends too in Santa Ana, and even here in Orange that didn't have father figures, and if you have a father, you can't obviously know what that like experience is like, but definitely like they talked to me about their experiences. My dad grew up without his dad too, so I was always told it at the home, and then just like the lack of a father figure though at the household can be like it's important. I think a lot of people don't talk about how important it is, for sure. And I know you mentioned too that like a lot of people gather their father figures from like hip hop or music.
Yeah.
And even through like, actors or people like celebrities, right? You just had Kobe pass away, and like he was an athlete that I thought was a lot of father figures to a lot of people, and not just in Southern California, but across the world,
Absolutely. You bring up a good point. For me, growing up, I always looked at people like Tupac Shakur, Dr. King, Martin Luther King. I always looked at folks like that as people that I wanted to model myself after. And even nowadays, like I find myself wanting to model my work and my values off of a lot of women. I actually find more inspiration from women than I do men. And I think that has to do with the fact that I was raised by women. But people like Maya Angelou, Angela Davis, Harriet Tubman, like these are modern day like superheroes to me. And so when I look at the work that I'm doing and the work that needs to be done moving forward, and I get fatigued and I get tired, I draw inspiration from learning about them and learning about how far they went, how they kept going, how they persisted. And it reinvigorates me to continue to go. And I think that's something that I think I took that from the fact that I was raised without a father, and my mom and my grandmother were like the modern day superheroes to me.
So growing up in Santa Ana, there's a lot of temptations all around. As a kid, how did you avoid kind of getting into trouble, and like how were you as a kid, and what were some of your interests?
Yeah, as a little boy, I was a very happy kid. I think I was like a huge jokester though. Okay. I was always joking around. I don't know if you remember, there's a movie called The Mask.
Jim
Jim
Carrey,
Carrey.
Yeah.
That was like my favorite. Somebody stopped me. Like I love that movie. But that was like one of my favorite movies. I loved Batman. Okay. I liked Barney a lot. I remember Barney. But like I grew up loving cartoons and animation, like Toy Story, Bugs Life. Like those are my favorites, But how I avoided temptations, I have an older brother, and my older brother, he's 3 years older than me, but he legitimately like nurtured me, comforted me, took care of me. Like we've never gotten into a fist fight ever.
Oh wow!
Not once. Not even on our worst day have we ever fist fought. Like we don't even disrespect each other. Like, and I remember when I was a little boy, he told me one day, he was like, our job as brothers is to never disrespect each other. And like I remember I was like 6 or something, and he told me that as like a 9-year-old, like we're never gonna hit each other. And we promised each other, and that's like one of the most powerful pacts that impacted my life, was as a young boy talking about manhood when we were still children, and we were like, we're never gonna hit each other. And he's like, you're my little brother, we don't have our dad, so we gotta look out for each other. So he taught me a lot, and he kept me away from making bad decisions. Growing up in a community like mine, making bad decisions is almost inevitable though.
Right.
And I think that's the hard part. But I had a dad that made all the worst decisions. So it made making good decisions that much easier, because I saw what happens when you don't. So temptations, they were a struggle early on, but as I got older, they became easier to just dismiss and reject.
At what point in your childhood, or maybe it came later in your life, but what point did you want to become someone who's active in the community and eventually run for city council like you are now?
Wow, very compelling question. I think I was maybe 12 or 13, like when I started getting involved in my community. Like I started off as an activist that young.
Yeah.
Like I was a little boy, and like I have pictures I could show you, but like I remember I was in 6th grade and the war in Iraq was just starting. Like we had just launched off to war, and I remember I didn't pledge allegiance to the flag as a little boy.
Like elementary, middle school?
Like 6th grade.
Okay.
Like freshly in 6th grade. Mr. Marzilli's class at Spurgeon Intermediate. I remember we launched off to war. I was young, and like, how do you explain terror to a 6th grader? And how do you explain going to war, you know, when we were just living our everyday life, and now the country's changed forever? So I didn't understand what that meant. And as a young boy, something in me just was like, I can't pledge allegiance to this flag right now. And so I remember I didn't do it, and I got suspended.
Oh, wow.
I got suspended, and they were like, you know, why didn't you pledge? And I remember responding to my principal, Mrs. Soto. I remember all their names. And I just remember saying, oh, I don't support the war. And she was like, mijo, you could still pledge allegiance and not support the war. And I was like, but you know, my cousins that are gonna have to fight this war, and I don't want to fight a war when I'm 18.
Yeah.
You know, I want to be able to go to college. And I still got suspended though, because my teacher, ironically, was a veteran. Respect to the veterans. But I was young, and so as I grew older, I got more politically involved. I think like by 7th and 8th grade, I started learning about feminism. I started learning about obviously, you know, how we got to war, the history of the Bush family, all the way down to how we trained, you know, Osama bin Laden.
Yeah.
How we supplied weapons to Hussein.
Because he was on our side back when we were fighting the communists, right?
Yeah, he was working with the CIA. So I remember learning about that in like 7th and 8th grade as a kid. So obviously when I got into high school, I got very politically involved in a local organization that did great work at the time. And so I was maybe in 9th grade at this time, and I threw my first concert as a kid. And this was a concert for the Iraqi orphanage. And so all the funds that we raised, we donated to the Iraqi orphanage. Because at the time, there was a lot of kids that were left without families because of our attacks. And I think history will show us that we were on the wrong side of history when it came to how we attacked and who we attacked. There was a lot of special interest at hand. And so, yeah, I raised funds for that. We had an initiative, too, back in the day when I was in high school. My brother and all my friends, it was called Food Not Bombs. Obviously, because we were in the middle of a war, we had a fundraiser where you could come to this concert. There were a lot of like conscious artists that were performing. We were kids, obviously. There was punk rock bands to crust punk bands, and you would bring a can of food or some sort of a good so that we can have food, not bombs, right? And it was just a really radical, cool movement for kids. And then 2006, we had the Million Man March in LA. So a large group of us took a bus down to LA. We marched, we protested. That was in 2006. I was a freshman. So like I started off then, and then as I moved into like my senior years of high school, I started advocating for less suspensions, less expulsions on our campuses, because I found that because I was poor and because gang violence was at an all-time high during my years in school, there were certain colors that you couldn't wear because if you did wear them, you were deemed a gang member.
Right.
So I would challenge that as a student, and I used to challenge it like, you know, for some of us, like we don't have a large wardrobe of clothes where we can just say, you know what, I can't wear this color. Like for some of us, it's, you know, $5 for $10 shirts.
Yeah.
You know, like at the factories.
You're right.
And it's like, it's affordable. And they only come in single colors. You have your whites, your browns, your greens, your blues. Like I remember.
And those are the most common right there.
Yeah, and it was $5 for $10.
Yeah.
So who's gonna say no to that? So I remember being a kid, that was part of the challenge, was dress code. And so like I got suspended for dress code when I was in high school. And it was hard to fight those things because nobody was advocating for students like they are now.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was like my generation got the short end of the stick, where we now see the long-term effects that suspensions and how that perpetuates the prison system.
Right.
Because when you take away the most consistent thing in a child's life, which is school, and you remove them from that, you then in turn create a pathway for them to go to prison and juvenile hall,
mm-hmm.
and jail, right? Because you're removing education from them during a time when they need it most.
Mm-hmm.
So what you do is you disrupt that learning process.
Mm-hmm.
So then you have a kid that might be suspended because he wore the wrong color or because he showed up late to class, right? And rather than asking, how can we help you get to school on time tomorrow?
Right.
How can we get you a different color shirt? We say, you're suspended and here's why.
Mm-hmm.
Why don't you get a class on time? Why do you keep wearing that shirt? You're gonna get fundamentally different answers. So as I grew older, I adopted a model where you don't ask why, you ask how.
Mm-hmm.
Because how is gonna give me a fundamentally different answer because it's responsive. Because I might ask somebody, why were you late to class?
Mm-hmm.
And they might have had a hellacious night where their parents were fighting and
Yeah.
they're in the middle of a divorce and that kid has to relive that trauma, right? So if I ask a student, how can I help you get to class tomorrow on time? I'm working with you.
Right.
Right? And that's what we need to see more of. So I advocated a lot for that
Mm-hmm.
as a student, but it was definitely a process.
Yeah.
A process.
That's one thing I currently work at after school program in Garden Grove, the Boys and Girls Club.
Oh, awesome.
But that's one thing I kind of emphasized too at the site I was at last year. Is there's one kid when I got there, I kind of got in there like 2 months into the semester, but he was known as a troublemaker, and he kind of popped off on one of the staff members, and everyone was like very quick to just like, hey, like we're gonna suspend him, or we're gonna not suspend him, we're gonna kick him out of the program, because I think he had already like slipped up a couple times to other students and whatever. But I was like, hey, no, like let me talk to him, and I kind of broke it down to him too, like, hey, you know, he was black, he was African American as well, so I said, hey, like because you're this way and you've done these things, people are just gonna keep associating you, and you're gonna go down this, you know, bad path, and they're just gonna keep taking you on the expelling you, suspending you, and you're gonna go down. It only gets worse as you get older, right? These kids are in middle school, with middle school kids. So I gave him another chance, and I said, hey, but I need you to, like, you know, not for us, but for you, like for yourself and your future, because I don't want you to go down this path. And sure enough, he got better over the course of the year.
Beautiful.
And it was like truly wonderful though, because I think it does, just having work in the school system, and it's not even with the district, it's after school program.
Absolutely.
You get to see like how much the teachers or what the principals tell them have an impact on the kids, and now the kids have like a negative thinking of themselves for being late, for missing school, or for getting in trouble. When I think J. Cole said it, it's like when they needed a rehabilitation instead of just being thrown into prison. And like we're sure you're wearing, right?
Yeah, the quote goes, I dedicate this to all the children affected in this nation by mass incarceration,
Right.
that sent your pops to prison when he needed education.
Yeah.
A beautiful line. And that's critical. Like that is where it's needed. You have to remember, like, these are children that are growing up against very difficult environments, very difficult obstacles that they have to overcome just to be a kid that reaches the age of 18.
Yeah.
So when all you've seen is adversity, you ask for love in the most unlovable ways, right? And I have a mentor, his name's Dr. Johnathan Hernandez, and he has a quote that I think is beautiful. And he says, the most wounded child tells the most truth. It's those kids that act out, right? And I think what I see when he says that is that these kids have no reason to lie. So when they act out, that's when you have to start to listen. It becomes their form of communication.
Right.
It becomes their cry for help. Is I have to do things that are radical and drastic to get you to listen. And after so many years of not being listened to, it becomes your response mechanism.
Yeah.
Right? And that was my response mechanism for a long time, as a kid. And as I grew older, I had to unlearn those things, and I think that's why I take this work so serious.
Mm-hmm. What were some of the tougher obstacles and challenges you faced growing up before you became 18?
Yeah, oh my goodness, wow. Well, for one, I think living in the environment I lived in, it was particularly very difficult. I grew up on Civic Center in Rate, in probably one of the toughest areas in Santa Ana.
Mm-hmm.
Like El Salvador Park, I lived 2 houses down from it.
Okay.
And it was, during that time, one of the most violent neighborhoods to live in Santa Ana. My dad was a gang member too.
Mm.
He was the president of the gang where I grew up.
Dang.
My uncles were a part of the neighborhood too. So the obstacles I had to overcome were generational. Because you have some families where, your dad's a construction worker and your grandpa's a plumber.
Mm-hmm.
So you have trades, and that's what your family does.
Mm-hmm.
My family, we didn't have that.
Mm-hmm.
My grandfather was the one success that I did see. He was a construction worker. He was a part of a union for 40 plus years, and he provided for us and took great care of us. So my obstacles were, where are the good men at?
Mm-hmm.
That was my obstacle, was where can I see people that look like me that want to help others? And it was very few and far between. But there was lots of great women and lots of strong women that were protecting me and protecting kids like myself. Some other obstacles where I had a lot of my friends that went to prison, starting with juvenile hall, starting with suspensions.
Yeah.
That's how it starts.
Right.
And they ended up going to juvenile hall, jail, and eventually prison. I had a couple of friends growing up that caught really grave cases, like for murder and stuff like that are doing life. And what really breaks my heart is, like, these were kids I used to play tag with.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, at one point in their life, they were just children.
Right.
And at one point in their life, all they knew was being a child.
Mm-hmm.
And what breaks my heart is that at some point, these kids were in a system and were in an environment where we did not utilize our resources properly to help them.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, I had a neighbor. This young man was amazing. His family was great. And I remember one day turning on the news and seeing that he had killed a mother and a daughter.
Oh, sorry.
And this was somebody I used to play tag with. Like, this kid would spend the night at my house.
Yeah.
And I was maybe 18 years old at the time.
Mm-hmm.
He was older than me. And I remember just thinking, how does that happen? I knew this kid.
Mm-hmm.
But then when I looked at the environments we grew up in, I looked at how little investment there was in communities like mine.
Mm-hmm.
I looked at how we lacked resources that addressed our traumas.
Mm-hmm.
And the development of our families and early learning education and programs that are essential like that. It made sense how a kid like that falls through the cracks. And that's, I think, what sparked my brain to say, okay, I'm fortunate to have had all those opportunities to self-destruct and to have not chosen them consistently. And although that journey's been difficult because it presents far more opportunities for us to fail than it does for us to succeed, I've persisted.
Mm-hmm.
I want to teach other young people to do the same. And better yet, I don't want them to be as good as me. I want them to be better, right? So I'm running for office to give them adequate amounts of resources so that they can do that, right? Because that's what this work is about. It's about opening up those doors for people that have been left out.
Mm-hmm. I think I can relate to that too, because I grew up in Santa Ana off Warner and Rate, and I went to Greenville, and in preteens my parents moved me out to Orange. But I remember when Facebook got big, I was in high school, and I remember like Facebooking some friends that I had, in elementary school and whatnot. And I remember asking about so-and-so, and you hear different stories, and even now as a 25-year-old, you hear, different kids from, like you said, the kids you played tag with, or played football with, or played basketball with, kids that I thought were smarter than me, kids that I thought were better athletes than me. They either got in trouble, they had a kid at a really young age, and just like, you hear these different things, but at one point in first grade, second grade, we were all, the same. We're all just wanting, you know, to play, to have fun. And like I said, some kids I thought were always smarter than me. I never thought I was the smartest. I never thought I was the most athletic. But, you know, some kids just went a little further than me, or I thought could have gone further than me, ended up being set short because of, you know, certain setbacks in their life. And, you know, that always inspired me to help, you know, my community. That's why I really like working with the kids, just because, you know, everyone, we don't all get even starts, right? I guess that's what you could say. And it's crazy, like you being born in Santa Ana. If you were born literally like 15 miles south in Costa Mesa or a nice suburb of Irvine, Tustin, your life could be so much different. But you have no control over that, you know?
Yeah.
And if you were in the Tustin School District, maybe things would have been different. If you were in Irvine School District, things probably would have been a lot different, you know? And just because you were born on this piece of land where they don't put that much attention and the resources, you're gonna suffer for it, you know? But I think when you work with kids, you realize that they're all pretty similar at the start.
Absolutely.
But life kind of corrupts them, or life does different things to them, you know?
Yeah, and that's where this work is most important, is in understanding and in identifying that these are children at some point.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm a social worker, so I work for a mental health program through the County of Orange, and I work entirely with foster youth.
Mm-hmm.
So I work with a group of amazing young children that started life at a disadvantage,
mm-hmm.
right? And they're placed into a system where, you know, families are suffering, and that trauma is passed down like generation through generation. So like, envision this, like the most important person in your life today, gone tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then envision this, the second most important person in your life is gone next year.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how do you feel now?
Yeah.
So then envision this, 4 years from now, the only friend that you have contact with is gone too.
Mm-hmm.
And you're only 7. Right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, we need to have that level of empathy and understanding
mm-hmm.
that these are children that we're dealing with, and they're having to navigate life and adversities that are so complex at such a young age that we're doing a disservice if we're not supplying resources and programs that are attentive to trauma, mental health, family needs, early learning education. If we're not doing that, we are giving them the most readily accessible option,
mm-hmm.
and that's to quit. We're telling you to quit.
Mm-hmm.
When your dollars are not, when your budget is not reflective of the needs of your community, you're doing your city a disservice.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why children, I think, are at the core of community work, is
mm-hmm.
because that is how you affect multiple generations of change.
Right. Because it is a little harder to change adults, but if you get it going at a young age, these kids will have it for their entire adulthood, and then they can pass it on to future generations.
Absolutely.
Right? Well, how do you help, or how do you, not so much you specifically, but how do we as like a group of people emphasize the importance of mental health and kind of make it more of a regular thing, not so taboo, you know?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that part of what we can do is have more dialogue and more conversations about the need to talk about how we feel,
mm-hmm.
right? So like, you can start small, like when you hang out with your friends, you can start small by like listening to music,
mm-hmm.
or when you watch a movie, being like, you know, what did you think of that song? You know, like, how'd you feel when you heard it?
Mm-hmm.
Like, you can start there. Like, anyone that knows me, if we watch a movie together, I'm gonna be like, hey, what'd you think of the movie?
Yeah.
What stood out to you?
Yeah.
You know, what was your thought on this character? You know, where did you think he struggled with? You know, it seemed like he was conflicted here, right? So I do that with my daughter all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So like, my daughter is amazing. You know, she and I have conversations about mental health, and she doesn't even realize it.
Oh, okay.
Like, we'll watch Lion King.
Yeah.
And then I'll tell her, like, Ebony, so, you know, what did you learn about Simba? And she'll tell me like what she learned, and I'll be like, what did Simba learn about himself? And so then now you're teaching these children comprehensive skills where she's able to identify, here's where change happened in his life.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, that's how you can start those small mental health conversations. It's just by asking people, how are you doing today?
Mm-hmm.
You know, how are you feeling? So if you see something's difficult or someone's going through a difficult time, it's safe to just say, you know, how are you feeling? Are you okay? Okay. And if someone doesn't want to talk about it, you respect it. I understand. I just want to let you know, if you need someone to talk to, you can reach out to me any hours of the night. I'm with you. I know how difficult that is right now. And just listening more. But you have to initiate those small conversations. And where it's discomforting is that we know there's a need for it, but we don't apply that area of dialogue where it's most critical.
Right.
Because guess what? If you can do it in your home, it's going to make you doing it in the community that much easier.
Right.
So if you can have those conversations with your brother, your mom, your dad, then in turn, the result will be you will have them much more frequently with everyone else that you meet. And then in doing so, your work will then be very reflective. Like, I don't think there's a thing I do where I'm not reflecting, you know? And then, like, if you want to have more in-depth mental health conversations, anytime you do something, whether it's good or bad, if you're with a group of your peers, just like ask, like, hey, do you mind if we take a couple minutes just to reflect about what we just did? You know, like, we were a part of a really amazing vigil, you and I. Like, with my team, like, I was like, you know, let's reflect. Let's over a barbecue.
Yeah.
And let's talk about what we did and what's next. Right? So we're always attentive to our mental health. So I think that's the tip I give people, is just start small. And the key question is, you know, how are you? How are you feeling? How's your day?
Yeah.
Use any one of those three questions, or you could use all three of them, you know, but start there for sure.
Yeah. And I've been really optimistic because I feel like in the past 5 years, I think people as a whole, especially in my generation, are really pushing that conversation, to have those conversations. So I hope in 10 to 15 years, and I see a lot of, especially in my line of work, I see a lot of people going to school to major in psychology, or, you know, I feel like in 15, hopefully sooner, but like in schools, especially in public school systems, elementary, middle school, high school, we're going to have just as many as we have as many teachers or counselors, we have just as many like mental health workers, right? Beautiful. At every school, because that's what I think, something that would help tremendously for all those kids at those young ages who experience really big hardships. And if you can get, like I said, if you can knock it out before they become adults and have all that trauma built up, that's the one thing I've noticed too. You know, my father, he experienced a lot of trauma that he sometimes would relinquish on us in a sometimes negative way. But I know if he would have had some sort of help, like as a kid, like who's to say like how different things would have been, you know?
I hear you. I hear you. And you bring up a great point. And that's ultimately why we're having this conversation now, is because of that experience, right? And so you take it with a grain of salt, because dad should have had those opportunities to heal too, right? Everybody deserves that. But unfortunately, we're starting to see, you know, something that works to our advantage moving forward is that we have a generation of young people that are coming up that are more frequent in having dialogue that is uncomfortable, right? Whether it be about politics, higher education, you know, trauma, the conversations are happening.
So you mentioned the vigil, Juneteenth, we were both part of that.
Yeah.
And you spoke. But I wanted to ask you, how did you first meet Farron Kidd with the Black OC and get partnered up with him?
Absolutely. So Farron Kidd is my brother from another mother, like to the fullest.
Yeah.
Like this gentleman and I are very much brothers. And we met in 2017. And Farron has a beautiful story, very strong story. I take inspiration from a lot of people, and he's definitely one of those individuals. And so he and I met. I was doing a lot of community work. You know, I've been doing community work now for about 10 plus years now. But there's a couple of different community events that he was attending, where I was a part of the organizing committees for them. One of them, most notably, was called The Roses That Grew from Concrete. I threw a concert. And this concert, it had a conference portion and a concert. So it started from, I think, 10 a.m. and it ended at midnight. So like full day. And so this event was a social change event that utilized hip hop, the arts, and education. as a building model to disrupt mass incarceration. So the conference portion included a panel that was focused on narrative therapy through the arts. So how are people able to effectively re-author their identity through the power of hip-hop and education, right? Like, how do you rewrite your story? Through learning and through being a hip-hop supporter. Number 2 was we had a dialogue that was had between a victim and a perpetrator, 2 opposing gangs, one gang member that shot the other, and both of these gentlemen are now friends, and they shared their stories.
Wow.
And so, like, somebody got shot in the face
Dang.
by the other guy, and they spoke at this conference, and they talked about the power of healing and education and how they were able to do that through education, come to that space of healing, right? And then we had a lecture by KRS-One.
Oh,
which is
he's
huge.
wonderful. I saw him in concert at the observatory.
The
He was rapping, and then he was also like preaching to us. That was wonderful.
It's KRS-One.
Yeah.
So we had a lecture by KRS-One, like once in a lifetime stuff.
Yeah.
And then we had, after that conference was over, we had a healing circle, which was private, which included all the artists that were performing, from KRS-One to Maya Jupiter to Blinds Brixton and Gifted Gab, Roses in Concrete, a community school out in Oakland, legislators, we had elected officials, we had students in the room, we had everybody that you could think of that is a hope dealer and a change maker in this room, having dialogue in private about how can we continue to build. Powerful. Then after that we had the concert. The concert included everyone from KRS-One to Aloe Black to Reverie to Blinds Brixton and Gifted Gab, Ruby Ibarra, the Philharmonic, the list goes on. Like, this was a stacked lineup. And it was a community event. And so it was all about social change. It was all about disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And it was all grassroots. So Farron and I really became close then through that. Because I've been working in the Black community for many years now. And I've been building with them. And, you know, my family is both Black and brown. And so when he and I connected, he reached out and we sat down at a Starbucks.
Nice.
And he was like, hey, you know, how did that event happen? And I was like, well, I've been doing this for a while now. Like, this is, we throw events like this. We do it once a year. And he was like, that had to be one of the most authentic representations of hip hop I've seen. Because there was nothing ignorant about it. It was Black and brown. He's like, that was the most Black people I've seen in Orange County in a long time. And I was like, that's common for my work. We work with the Black community very closely, because, you know, Black liberation is brown liberation. So these conversations were happening years ago. And I remember in our meeting, I talked about a brand that I built. And the brand was called Building Community Through Hip Hop. And I said, what I do is I build community through hip hop. I do it across the state of California. And the result of building community through hip hop is intersectional community organizing. So you're able to pass legislation, you're able to advocate for policies at the grassroots level, and you're able to provide service. And you do it through the power of hip hop. Build communities. And I said, there's another movement that I want to expand upon that we need to build. And he was like, what is that? And I was like, it's Black and brown excellence. And he's like, what's that? And I was like, that's a platform for intersectional organizing, where, you know, we're 2 communities that have been dismissed, silenced, funneled through the prison system, deported, and targeted by police. And we're not reminded of our excellence. We come from royalty. And I said, so let us exemplify that. Let us accentuate the excellence that is your community and the excellence that is mine. And let us come together and let's do it as one. And it's Black and brown excellence. And so we began to move on building that. And so since he and I met that day, he was like, how come you didn't do anything with it? And I was like, because I was waiting for you. Like, it sounds silly,
Yeah.
but I truly I mean that.
Yeah.
Like, I sat on that for years, and I couldn't do nothing with it because, in theory, it sounds cool. It sounds beautiful, right? But life isn't just lived on theory.
Right.
Like, you need to find someone that wants to not only exemplify it, but wants to advance it.
Mm-hmm.
And Farron wanted to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was like, take it, man. Take it. I'm going to be right alongside you. I'm going to be supporting you and amplifying your voice in all the ways that I could.
Mm-hmm.
And he's somebody that inspires me. I'm empowered by Farron.
Yeah, I've only heard him speak twice, but I'm really inspired by him as well. And that's something I talked about with Doughboy Tony. I recorded an interview with him earlier this week. I don't know if you're familiar with the artist.
Yeah, he's awesome. I'm
Yeah.
really proud of my Raza and what he's doing.
But yeah, we were just talking about how a lot of different people could say what Farron Kid says at his speeches, but the way he says it kind of leaves a certain impact on you for a longer period of time. And it reminds you of the great speakers that you listen or that you learn about in history books like Martin Luther King or Malcolm X or some of those guys where he has a little bit of militancy to him, but he's very poetic about it as well.
I love his militancy.
Yeah.
I love it.
Because you need it for something at this magnitude, for a movement like this. And just to touch on what you said earlier too, the building the community through hip hop, I love that because I'm a huge hip hop fan, and from my early days, like my parents, my dad specifically, and a lot of my uncles, they played a lot of like Public Enemy, a lot of NWA, and they played a lot of other music too. They had a really good like music library, but those songs and artists stood out to me a lot. So when I got older, I really like dove deep into like Lupe Fiasco, Absol, and a lot of artists that were kind of like even Kendrick Lamar. J. Cole now is one of my favorite artists, Joey Badass as well. But just going back to the visual, when we all held up, I was a part of that moment where everyone held up either a brown or black excellence shirt, and we're all standing side by side. You know, the blacks were holding brown excellence, and brown people, Latinos, were holding up the black excellence. And it just it was super powerful, man. That almost made me like cry right after, because there was a song by Absol called Terrorist Threats. I don't know if you're familiar with it. But he says in the song, in the chorus, you know, if all the gangs in the world unify, we stand a chance against the military tonight. And I always thought he meant like little like Bloods and Crips, the Vatos, and every like gang.
I think he is talking about that.
Yeah, but when we did that, I felt like it was bigger than that. It was like the LGBT family uniting with the Black Excellence and Brown Pride family, and just all like, you know what I mean. It's just more than like your local street gangs. It's communities as a whole unifying together. And
I'll cheers to that.
Yeah, for real.
And do you have water?
Yeah.
Okay, let's cheers to it. And that's why I when I met Farron, I was like, look, Farron, black and brown excellence is needed because, you know, school's not prisons, it's powerful. But for some people, you know, education isn't their lane. It's not something they're passionate about. Some people want to graduate high school and go right into a trade.
Yeah. And
become a carpenter or whatever it may be. And that's valuable too. Mm-hmm. So I said, but black and brown excellence, it covers everything. It's intersectional. And I said, because there's one thing we will always be first. I said, Farron, if you were an architect, or if you were an educator, or if you were a musician, it wouldn't matter to America because you'd be black first.
Right.
And I said, and if I were a scholar, if I were an astronaut, or if I were a dancer, I'd be a brown architect. I'd be a brown astronaut first.
Right.
So I said, so we got to deal with that. And I said, so let us be excellent if that's what we are first to America, and let us empower people through their identities. And I think we've done a good job at doing that. And it's crazy because that was a conversation had between two individuals in private. Mm-hmm. And then 3 years later, almost 4 years later, there's a community holding up, like black community holding up brown excellence shirts and brown community holding up black excellence shirts. Mm-hmm. There was a time, I don't know if you've ever seen the picture on Instagram, where it was just Farron and I wore black excellence and he wore brown excellence. And we started there, just he and I wearing that. Uh-huh. And it happened on accident. Like, I had a black excellence shirt. He made brown excellence and black excellence shirts. It just so happened that I took the black excellence one. He wore the brown one. Uh-huh. And then we were like, I think the world needs to see more of that.
Yeah.
You know? And we stand in solidarity with the Black community, and Black Lives Matter, absolutely, especially here, especially in my city. And I'm gonna make sure that we kick in the doors so that we have opportunities for the Black community here. I don't care if there's 1% or 1,000,000% in my community. If we have 1 or 10,000 members of the Black community, we will go to bat to make sure that their voice is heard and that they have the resources that their families need. And to take it a step further, that we empower them to run for office so that they have a seat at the table too. Because having me, advocate for the community, that's just not enough. We need more. We need more people to come out and to support these issues and to boldly show us that Black Lives Matter. Not just say it, but to show us. Because I know for damn sure my community, we matter.
Yeah.
Orange County's not showed us that Black Lives Matter.
Right.
Historically, they've not. In my community, we've had to fight for our equity and for our freedom and dignity. It was a long battle. But we have that experience. We have that platform. We have those resources now. We have those buildings. So let us do something good with it. Let us open up doors to make those fights easier for a community that needs us most right now.
Right. And there's different areas where you can go too, because it's been echoed at a lot of the rallies and protests that I've been to, but we need more Black and brown people in all positions of power, not just politics and in office. But I was listening to a podcast the other day that there's only one Black principal in the entire Orange County. Orange County's a big ass county, and a lot of schools, they just think about all the schools that are in Orange County, there's only one Black principal. And I know off of percentage wise, there's more Black people in Orange County than what that represents, So it's just getting people their foot in the door, so we're not just seen as Mexicans or brown people are laborers and they work on landscaping or work with their hands. They can do other things too, like you said, being an astronaut, being an educator, being a principal, and same thing for the Black community. Being a counselor, exactly. Anything. It doesn't have. You don't have to be the big famous person, but sometimes even just being a teacher. Because I would talk about it on a few other podcasts as well. I think the first person of color that I had as a teacher, I want to say was in high school. And they were my Spanish teachers. I was actually in middle school. So the only people of color that I had up until college was Spanish teachers that were persons of color. A lot of my teachers have been predominantly white.
Great point.
And it's just something that you, as a kid, you constantly see that. Well, okay, then if you're a brown or Black kid growing up, you're like, okay, well then I can't be a teacher because that's not what's portrayed to me. All these white people are teaching me. And there's I can go into about history books too, and how I disagree with some of the things, that they teach you. But it's just I feel like we need to have more people of our community everywhere, not just the one lane.
You are touching on something so important, and I think that's why, Santa Ana, I can only speak to Santa Ana. We have 1 in 10 kids that will graduate college, so we can get kids to college. That's not a problem, but to get them to finish, it's 1 in 10 kids, right? So you brought something up that is so crucial to that data, because you're going through 13 years of education. That's the amount of years we spend in public ed, right?
Yeah.
But how many opportunities and how many times are kids seeing themselves leave that classroom? So the purpose of education in communities like mine isn't to become an educator. It's to leave your community. That's the value of education, is get this and get out of here. Go to college and don't come back.
Yeah.
So what's the value of that if my community isn't good enough, right? Because when you have a system of education where neighbors are teaching their neighbors, where people like you and I are teaching folks that come from our communities, the value of that education is going to be significantly higher, and the emphasis on higher education is going to be there. So more kids are going to be inclined to say, on their hardest days, I remember Maestra XYZ, right? And maybe that inspires them to become a teacher.
Right.
But I think you touched on something so critical, and ultimately it's because we don't see ourselves in those positions where we are making change, right? And to take it a step further, that does something to our kids. It does something to our kids because they have teachers that they know are not willing to be in their neighborhood past 5 o'clock p.m.
Yeah.
Right?
Right.
So what do you think that does to these kids?
Mm-hmm.
My teacher is good enough to work for my school, but doesn't see enough value in my community to live here.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So these kids, they don't get to choose that.
Mm-hmm.
They have to stay here. And part of how that affects how we develop children in Santa Ana is because kids are seeing violence and drugs and funerals before graduations. Like, how that affects kids is that there was a study that was done. There's a book called The Boy Who Was Raised by a Dog. The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog by Dr. Bruce Perry.
Mm-hmm.
And amazing studies were done by this doctor. And this book details trauma and how it affects the development of children. And what we have found in the field of psychology and in neurology was that children that are experiencing an unnatural living conditions are experiencing PTSD at a rate that is higher than soldiers leaving the battlefield.
Wow.
As a matter of fact, it's so complex that the field of psychology re-diagnosed it. And it's now called CPTSD, chronic post-traumatic stress disorder, because kids have to relive their trauma every day living in these communities.
Mm-hmm.
Because where your dad might have gotten shot or where your best friend might have gotten picked up and deported, you have to walk past that every day.
Yeah.
Right? So it's like these kids relive that.
Wow.
So I take that into account when I do my work in the community,
mm-hmm.
because I know there's parts in my neighborhood that certainly affect me.
Mm-hmm. So going back to your work in the community,
mm-hmm.
how did you get started with Santa Ana Unidos and as well as the Roses That Grew from Concrete?
I got started because there was no place for kids like myself. I became a father at a very young age. I was 17 years old at the time, and I was just finishing high school. And it's so difficult to say because I don't even want to say it was foreign to me. It was almost like part of the process, it felt like. Mm-hmm. And growing up in my city, young men and women are sexualized at a very young age.
Oh, yeah.
There isn't sexual education. Like during the time that I was growing up in Santa Ana, there was no. In our community was definitely not proactive in having these conversations with kids, mm-hmm. and they're very, very much needed. And I was just a young kid that was just unaware of what happens when you aren't being safe and you're not, being educated about what you're doing. I was a child, and I became a parent, and I remember navigating school and being a parent at a young age and having to work, and then I remember becoming 18 and having to get my first apartment, mm-hmm. 333 South Flower Street, apartment 18. I will never forget it.
Uh-huh.
I paid $975 a month.
Wow.
And I remember being proud of being able to provide for my daughter at 18. I had a union job, which helped me do that. Mm-hmm. But I remember just it being extremely difficult. And then that's when I realized how little resources are out there in the community to support kids that are developed through trauma. Mm-hmm. Because there's kids that are developing through music, kids that are developing through education, but then there's kids that live in communities like mine, mm-hmm. where you're surrounded by police, you're surrounded by violence, mm-hmm. and gangs and trauma and drugs.
Right.
And so that becomes your developmental system. And then so how do we reach those kids? How do we change their lives, mm-hmm. when we don't even want to acknowledge them? And I think that's the hard part, is you have to acknowledge that these kids are experiencing that. Mm-hmm. And so as I grew as a young father, I started to see how little systems were in place to help those kids. And I got involved in activism in different activist organizations, and I saw how little people like myself, mm-hmm. had a seat at the table. I saw definitely people that came from higher ed, definitely a lot of Latinx folks, but I didn't see kids that came from generational, houses where we had, gang trauma and, violence and drug abuse in the household. I didn't see a lot of kids like myself at the table. And so I opened up these organizations because I saw a need to help kids that our community didn't want to allocate resources to. I saw kids that needed a place to go where they can be safe, because maybe they would get shut out and kicked out of the Boys and Girls Club. Right? I needed to open a place where kids can just be kids and be accepted, and where we can provide unconditional love and unconditional care. And it presented many challenges to do that. I was 22 years old at the time when I did it. And it started off with a boxing club. And opening a boxing club, in theory, it was amazing and it was needed. But then I saw how many barriers came in providing services. Because you have to pay for a building. You have to pay for insurance. And then you have landlords that want to capitalize on not the good that you're doing, but on the fact that they can take money from you. And I started to see that more and more. And it made progress extremely difficult, because I was a 22-year-old kid that wanted to do good in the community, because I saw that my city was not stepping up to invest in young people. And so there's a quote that says, successful people grew tired of having things happen to them, so they decided to go out and happen to things. Right? So that was my response, is like, I'm going to go out and I'm going to happen to these things, and I'm going to do my best to provide a place for kids to box, right? So we did that. It got extremely expensive, and it got progressively more difficult as time went on. And we wouldn't have been able to do that without the help of Labor's Local 652, which is a local labor union in Santa Ana. They helped us out with making sure that we paid our rent. But then moving forward, Roses in the Concrete was focused very much on the school to prison pipeline. So doing work with students and addressing and acknowledging everything that I just mentioned. Like all of that trauma, all of those other things that get in the way of a kid's self-actualization. Roses in the Concrete aimed to do that, right? But then again, it's like, we didn't have federal funding. We didn't have thousands of grant dollars. And I was a single father, a young kid that was looking to do this. And it was just, there was no place for the work that I was looking to do to be supported. And then even in trying to align and affiliate with different organizations that were activist organizations, they were already not advocating for these issues. They were already not advocating for kids that we were looking to serve. So it made it particularly very difficult to provide services that I thought were needed. And now we're at a time where people now understand, okay, something needs to be done. So I think that at the time, the community wasn't ready for the work that we were doing. Because like, building with the Black community, we've been doing that for years. It shouldn't have taken police killings for us to value their lives. And to value now accessing and reaching the Black community. Because people like myself had already been doing it for years. And we were not supported. We didn't get grant dollars. We didn't have the hundreds of thousands of dollars. We did it all as volunteers. And it made things extremely difficult, but we knew the need for it, right? And so that's why Farron and I became really close, was because he was like, yo, how don't you guys have funding for it? And I was like, tell me where it's at. You know, we have a quote, and it's like, this is real work.
Yeah, you said that at the vigil.
Like, it's not just work that you do for a day and you go like, okay, I protested. We'll wake up tomorrow and things are gonna be better. Like, this is real work. Like, folks are really out here in the trenches. And they're happy to be in those trenches to do that work. And I was proud to do this work and not get paid for it. Because this, to me, this is a part of my responsibility. It's just, I couldn't envision me doing something different. Like, there's no way. Like, even if it costed me money to do it, I'd do it, you know? But it's just, I know how much I would have needed it when I was a kid. And I know how many friends it would have saved. Had we had this when I was a young boy, I probably would have had a lot of friends that wouldn't have went to prison.
Mm-hmm.
That's why if you look at like my social media, I proudly represent Artesia Pilar,
Mm-hmm.
and I proudly represent my ward, because I don't see young people coming from my ward.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see young people coming from Artesia Pilar, because most of my friends ended up gangbanging and ended up dead or in prison.
Mm-hmm.
So I pay homage and I pay respect to those that fell through the cracks,
Mm-hmm.
because their lives were valuable too.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what my work is about. It's about valuing people unconditionally. It's about providing unconditional care and unconditional love to everybody,
Mm-hmm.
even the folks I disagree with most. And that's where I'm most proud of, is that you learn about yourself and your work through how you treat people that you disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
And Farron and I have done a good job in being graceful with folks that aren't on the same page with us.
Mm-hmm.
And we hope that in time that we are able to effectively create a place for dialogue that is both safe and inclusive, that has values of empathy, hope, and compassion,
Mm-hmm.
so that people can start that process of learning,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because racism is not, there's nothing natural about it.
No.
It's taught.
Yeah.
Right? Just like love and hope is taught. Like somebody taught you that skill, and that's why you're having this conversation right now.
Right.
Because you see value in it. And somebody taught me that skill.
Mm-hmm.
I had mentors to do that. So we need to do more of it.
Mm-hmm. And going based off of that, and then I'll ask you something else afterwards.
Yeah.
But I studied communications, and I learned about how the mass media affects just like people, the masses as a whole. And I know now a lot of our cartoons and shows are more progressive, but back then there was a lot of shows that portrayed Asians as this, portrayed Mexicans and blacks as this. You know what I'm saying? So institutionally it was taught. Sometimes not even by our teachers or by people in power, but a lot of times by just the the media corporations, and there's only, I still get a trip off of remembering this statistic, because I believe it's like about 94 or 95% of media, so that means like radio stations, TV stations, are owned by 6 different companies. Right?
Yeah.
The Disney Corporation, the people who own Fox, I think it's 20th Century Fox.
Now Disney owns that.
Okay, so now it's probably 5 then.
Yeah.
Turner, which owns TBS, TNT, and a few other channels.
Huh.
And then I forgot the 3 other ones,
Does
but
Oprah have stake in that?
I don't think if she does, she might have the other 5%. But I remember it was like mid 90% were owned by those 6 companies. So all the radio stations, all the TVs, that's why they sound so similar, because those companies are all trying to put off the same message. And sure, I'm sure they're getting more progressive as time has come, but for a long time, I'm sure they portrayed a lot of negative images. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely.
That really kind of just developed a lot of bad stereotypes about people, and then just, continue to separate our people. Black and brown communities, Asian communities as well, people of minorities or people of color,
Absolutely.
And then also transitioning off what you said earlier too, because I think this is the time for change, but I thought things were going to change in 2014 after Trayvon Martin. I thought things were going to change in 2016 after Ferguson, Missouri. What do you think, and I'll ask bigger picture and also just Santa Ana and Orange County, but do you think Santa Ana and Orange County, and then bigger picture, the world, is ready to make this change systematically?
Yeah, I think that we need systemic change. I think we need to do it. We can start locally, right? And then we can work our way up to federal change. When you look at the landscape of America and what we've experienced over the last couple of years, I can only speak to my community right now, that in Santa Ana, historically, this city is not cared about Black people.
Mm-hmm.
There's woke spaces, like activist organizations, that had money and resources and buildings that have built zero alliances with the Black community. And these are supposed to be our hope dealers, right? So like if even some of our most woke spaces don't see the value in it, then that's where we have to start. You change your world, you change the world, right? But you got to start with yours. So what we got to do is we have to have these conversations internally in our homes with our family members, with the people that we love, all the way down to like your relationships, right? And you can't throw people away. So when folks are not knowing or maybe say something ignorant, don't take that as an opportunity to throw someone away.
Right. Cancel culture.
Yeah, you have to see value in learning. So let us create that, right? Start there. Once you can do that and you can create and embrace dialogue, then change will slowly start to happen. Like, I know there's people talking about abolishing police, right? And there's people talking about defunding police. And then there's strategies, right? So it's like, you cannot abolish something without slowly taking away power. Like, defunding is part of that strategy. Like, that's step one, right? So when you look at systemic change, where it's most needed is in our communities of color and in how we interact with each other. If we can systemically change how we build, then we're going to see something revolutionary. Because history's taught us this. You either build or you destroy where you come from. Right? So let us build. And let us build political power. And then let us show up to City Hall. Let us show up to, vote. Let us show up to support Black businesses. Let us show up to free kids from deportation centers. Let us show up to embrace Black leadership. Let us show up to have more women in power. Let us show up to support developing children. And when we do that, systemic change is inevitable. You wouldn't be able to move away from it. That's going to be the result of it, is something critical. And when you are able to do all these things, I think that in turn, over the next 4 to 8 years, we will see a lot more investment in communities. Because what we're talking about nationwide with this issue of policing, it's not foreign. Because our country has been defunding education for a long time.
Right.
Since 1980, the state of California has built 23 prisons. And the University of California has built 1 campus since 1980, right? How come people don't think that's radical?
Yeah.
That's insane.
Right.
So, look at this. We're in Orange County. Santa Ana is a neighboring city to Irvine. Irvine was the safest city in the U.S. a couple years ago.
Yeah,
but guess what? Nobody calls it defunding the police in Irvine. Because they've already done it. They allocate more resources to developing their neighborhoods and their youth and their families than they do policing their families and their communities. There's not a neighborhood you're going to live in where you see police officers drive multiple times down your street, because that's not their interest. Their interest is not to suppress their residents. Their interest as a city is to develop their families. So when a family has a domestic dispute, they're not sending officers with their guns out. They're responding to issues as needed.
Right.
So when a young man has a DUI and crashes into a pole in Irvine, they respond to that differently.
Yeah.
They resource their community centers. They add more resources to supporting families. Santa Ana, it's expected. So when a young kid dies, you don't see a grieving mother on TV, because that's a part of that process. There's a different quality of life here, right?
Yeah.
So why don't we have that same energy in suppressing our people with police? Why don't we have that same energy in eradicating poverty? Like,
homelessness too.
Homelessness, right? Like, why don't we advocate to have a across the table minimum wage in Santa Ana, a rent cap, a affordable housing policy that is equitable for our residents, a just cause eviction policy. Why don't we advocate for things like that? And when you do that, in turn, you will have a more equitable, safe community. That's the result.
Right.
So it's nothing radical what people are asking for. They're just asking to be invested in.
Right.
And investments and in public safety doesn't mean that you have to send me to jail or prison.
Mm-hmm.
It just means that you shouldn't see me as only a criminal.
Right. Dang, that was deep.
Yeah, thank you.
Love hearing that stuff.
It's that real stuff that we just need to talk more about,
Mm-hmm.
because it's not rocket science.
Mm-hmm.
It's like cities are already doing this.
Right.
They're just not happening in urban cities.
Cities that need it, right.
They're happening in affluent cities.
Mm-hmm.
They're happening in affluent cities like Irvine.
Mm-hmm.
They're not happening in Santa Ana.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we don't have police, who's going to arrest those criminals?
Mm-hmm.
Or why are we looking at our people like criminals?
Right.
Fundamentally, something's wrong there.
Yeah.
Right? Because I don't see a criminal. I see my brother.
Mm-hmm.
I see my neighbor. I see a child. I see a dad.
Mm-hmm.
So why do you see that? Right? So fundamentally, there's something different.
Mm-hmm.
Ironically, my opponent is the sheriff
Really?
that I'm running against. Yeah.
For the City Council Ward 5?
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
My opponent's the sheriff.
Okay. What's the biggest challenge as far as running for a city council position? Is this your first time running?
Absolutely. Yeah. I'm not a fan of politics.
Mm-hmm.
I am very much not a politician.
Okay.
I'm a community organizer. I'm a boy that comes from Santa Ana's ghettos, and I'm proud of it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and I'm a father, more importantly. But I'm a man of the people.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so the challenge is this: getting people to see value in our residents, because so many of our residents have went through adverse living experiences. So many of them have been harmed. So many have went through trauma. So many are still trying to just make it, right? Mm-hmm. That we dismiss them and we critique them
Mm-hmm.
for all of their imperfections and their flaws. I marvel at them. I embrace their tenacity to keep on going, right? I think that's the biggest challenge, is I'm running for city council in a ward that is not a very popular ward,
Mm-hmm.
but it's where I'm from and I'm proud of it. My ward has a lot of good history, and it has a lot of history that has affected my people, good and bad. So there's 3 values that I have, and it's hope, compassion, and equity, right? So it takes a great deal of hope to experience all of what Santa Ana has to offer, and to still want to keep going,
Mm-hmm.
and to still want to stay in the city. It takes a great deal of compassion to know that our residents are not defined by their mistakes. And it takes experiencing injustices to know that our people deserve equity.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, the biggest challenge, is always having hope, compassion, and equity at the forefront of my work. My opponent seems to be a nice guy.
Mm-hmm.
I'm very respectful of him, and I'm not somebody that operates in a way where I like to dismiss people,
right,
or talk down to them. That's just not my style. But we're fathers. He's a dad too. We both have daughters. I respect that.
Mm.
But he doesn't have the same lived experience that I have in my community.
Right.
And I think that ultimately, that is what will prevail.
Mm-hmm.
And I know firsthand how hard I go for my community.
Mm-hmm.
I don't need a title to do this work. I don't need to win this election to do good for my community.
Mm-hmm.
I'll continue to do it.
Right.
It's just, if I have that seat, I can do it at a much larger scale.
And amplified, yeah.
And I can create policies that will truly protect our residents.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm doing it.
That's wonderful.
But ultimately, you know, if it's not in God's plan,
Mm-hmm.
then I will still continue to do this work.
Mm-hmm. And that's one thing I think that needs to be, especially in policing too. How can you police that community if you've never lived in that community? How can you represent that community if you've never lived in that community? How can you teach that community if you've never lived that community? So I think it's something that goes in politics, but in a lot of different areas as well.
Yeah.
I know you got to go, but before we wrap things up, I do like to ask a couple fun quick hitters just to kind of get the audience to know you a little bit more.
Yeah.
if you could talk to any person in history, dead or alive, who would you want to chat with?
I love that question. Rosa Parks.
Ooh, okay.
Yeah, Rosa Parks. Just because, obviously, before the bus strike,
Mm-hmm.
it was over 380 days, right? But that woman was so inspiring, and even all the way down to how she led a lot of the fights before that happened.
Mm-hmm.
She's an inspiration. Rosa Parks, Maya Angelou.
Mm-hmm.
Maya Angelou is probably the most influential to me.
Mm-hmm.
My daughter is named after her.
Wow.
My daughter's name is Ebony Maya.
Okay.
Yeah.
Wow.
Tupac Shakur, of course. Tupac Shakur. Malcolm X.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
He was a G. Like, he's the OG activist.
Right? Yeah.
Like, he was pro-immigrant. Like, he was with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
You know? Yeah, I would definitely chop it up with Jesus. I'd be like, yo, so let's talk about this, man.
Okay.
No. I think those are the folks to talk to for sure.
Okay.
Yeah.
If you could visit any time period or history, where would you want to visit?
Civil rights movement.
The 60s?
Yeah. I definitely would have been a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I probably would have got killed by police, but I definitely would have been a part of that. I think another time too would be the Mexican Revolution.
Oh, yeah.
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 That was pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
You know what's crazy is a lot of people don't know that was black and brown led.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah. They had slaves in Mexico, too. And,
Yeah, and they stood with us.
Uh-huh.
Mexico was one of the first countries to abolish slavery.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, we had a black president.
Wow.
Yeah.
What
So
was his name?
let me get his
He
name.
only served, I remember hearing about that. I forgot his name, but
Yes,
he only
yes.
served, like, what, 2 or 3 months?
Well, this brother, hold on one second.
Mhm.
Hold on. This brother had a powerful history in our country, and in what he ended up doing for Mexico. His name was Vicente Guerrero,
Okay.
right? So he was president for just a couple of months, not too long.
Dang.
And the thing about him was that he was one of the lead revolutionary generals.
Mm-hmm.
And this was in the Mexican War of Independence. And he fought against Spain, fought against their colonizers.
Mm-hmm.
And so, what an inspiration.
Yeah.
Right? And I think I would have visited that time for sure.
Last few ones. If you could have any kind of exotic pet, what would you want to have?
I'm gonna go with a lion.
Okay.
Yeah, I got a lion tattooed on my arm. I
Oh,
love
okay,
lions.
okay.
Yeah.
All right. And then if you were stranded on an island and you did food and water were provided, but what were 3 things you would want to bring with you to pass the time?
Food and water?
Yeah, food and water are provided, so you don't have to worry
Okay.
about those.
Even though food and water are provided. Gummy bears, for
Okay.
sure. Gummy bears. Music, without a doubt, music. And I can pick people or no?
Yeah, you can pick people.
My daughters.
Okay, wonderful.
Yeah.
All right, and then last one. If you could give any advice to your younger self, what would it be?
Keep going.
Mhm.
Keep going. And no matter how hard it gets, always be graceful. I think that would be my advice. Because, like, being a young father and inserting yourself into a community that doesn't want to see people like us do good and doing good, it presents a lot of opportunities to quit and to stop. And my advice to my younger self would be keep going, and when times get tough, remember to just always be graceful to you first, right? Because we're not graceful to ourselves enough. And so just giving myself that permission to just be soft, right? So that'd be my advice.
Well said. Really want to thank you again for hopping on the show.
Absolutely, brother. Thank
If
you.
you want to plug anything, how people can vote for you or your Instagram, whatever you want to promote, go ahead.
Absolutely. First and foremost, follow Black OC. They're doing critical work here in Orange County, and we need to amplify Black voices. So follow Black OC, follow Mobilize the People, OC Protests, another, couple of Black organizations doing amazing work in Orange County. We certainly need to make sure that we have a hub for the Black community so that they can empower and build community respectively, and we can support them. Secondly, make sure that you register to vote and use your voice this election season, because if you don't, someone else will use it for you. And that's a scary thing. Do your research on the state electeds. Focus on those races. I'd say if you're conflicted with presidential races, focus on Congress and Senate.
Right.
Focus there. At least we can pass legislation through that. And lastly, if you are a Santa Ana resident, continue to hold your head up high. Stay strong. Don't give up this fight. This is going to be a long battle for equity and justice, and I encourage you just to keep persisting. If you listened all the way through, I thank you. And if you want to get involved, vote this election season. If you want to get involved in our campaign, send us a message. Our website is hernandezforsantaana.org. And you can follow us on Instagram at Hernandez for Santa Ana, number 4, not 4.
Okay. Awesome. Well,
Cool.
thank you very much again.
Thanks.